But first, I want to turn to something we've discussed quite a few times, particularly last week. And this is the ever-increasing hectares and hectares of public land that's been closed off to ordinary Australians under the guise of cultural heritage concerns. Now, as always, ground zero for this madness is Victoria, where a climbing ban has been put in place at Mount Arapiles. This is in the state's Grampians region, with little to no public consultation due to the state's cultural heritage laws. In fact, it's all so bad, the CEO of Parks Victoria has even admitted, and I quote, "We don't consult on cultural heritage," he says. Well, this has come to the fore because of the outrage over the climbing ban, but it speaks to a much bigger issue, which has now come to the attention of the federal parliament. Late this afternoon, Senators Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Senator Jonathan Duniam have given notice of a motion to force an urgent inquiry into cultural heritage laws across Australia. They will, of course, examine the climbing ban, but also the Barengi gold mine decision. Joining me now to discuss the specifics of Mount Arapiles, President of the Australian Climbing Association, Mike Tomkins. Well, Mike, I know in the case of Mount Arapiles in Victoria, we're dealing with state legislation.
Yes.
What do we know about these cultural heritage laws?
There are two items of legislation that are really causing a lot of this trouble, and it's causing problems that don't really need to exist. And the individuals concerned, both the Indigenous corporations, the climbers, Parks Victoria, are all beholden to this legislation. The first is the Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006, which was brought in by the Steve Bracks government. That has got clauses within it that make harm to Aboriginal artefacts punishable by huge fines for both individuals and for corporations.
Right.
And Parks Victoria does not administer that act. Parks Victoria, in fact, is bound by that act. So they can't actually invoke fines at Mount Arapiles. So that there's, to some degree, this is a bit of a moot point until we get the Aboriginal Heritage Act amended, which is the Victorian legislation 2006.
And you said there was another bill, another piece of law?
The other piece of legislation is the Parks Victoria Act 2018, brought in by the Andrews government. That has distanced Parks Victoria from the reach of the Minister for the Environment, who holds that portfolio. And the Minister can just brush off any questions and any political heat onto the CEO of Parks Victoria, who's relatively helpless in this situation because he's bound by the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which is administered by First Nation state relations.
Yeah, but so, the net result is we elect politicians who out of this brouhaha say they can't do anything, or they don't have to consult, or they don't even have to take into account the economic impact of these climbing bans. I mean, the whole area of Natimuk and the Grampians region exists for people using these parks responsibly. But at the same token, so you've got the politicians washing their hands, you've got the CEO of Parks Victoria saying, we're not required to consult, so we haven't. We've got no flexibility. We're stuck with the Act as it is, and we must administer it very tightly. And you've got poor old Victorian taxpayers locked out of Crown land assets, national parks that should belong to everyone.
Absolutely, and this is leading to what's likely to be a commodification of public land if we don't stop this legislation as it stands.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if the parks are handed over to freehold corporations by Indigenous corporations,
yes,
then there's only a handful of people that are stopping the commodification, and the financial agreements can be made. Corporations will be corporations. That is their way. And you can't blame corporations for using legislation to their own advantage. So there's no blame on individuals. There's no blame on Parks Victoria in some sense. You could say they've behaved not in the way we'd like them to behave under this circumstance, but they're acting in their best interests. The Indigenous corporations are acting in their best interests, and everybody is losing because ultimately our parks that were set aside under national federal law in 1975, the National Parks Act, to set aside for the nation to be areas that are kept from development and the areas that are presented to the public as recreational spaces. So those two things are not going to occur if we continue with those two items of legislation as they are.
And they'll be treated like cultural museums, but only open to a fraction of Australia's population by the way they're going.
The access to these spaces will be monetised, absolutely, if this legislation is not fixed. So we're calling for a select committee on rock climbing in the Victorian Parliament, similar to the select committee on duck hunting, which successfully overturned the move against another similar activity. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The climbers are very much in the forefront of this, because if this legislation is not repealed, there will be difficulty for farmers, for landowners, for householders, for councils, for everybody.
You are the test case constituency.
Very much so, and this is causing a lot of heartache in the climbing world, not just in the local town of Natimuk, which is a climbing town, and everyone's in a terrible state there because of all this, all caused by legislation, not by individual action. Melbourne, lots of people go rock climbing. It's become a very, very popular sport. Across Australia, Arapiles is the most precious location, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of climbers all over the world dream of coming here one day, and they've just crossed it off their list.
Right, we'll come back to this. Obviously, we'll watch tomorrow that Senate inquiry to see if it gets up. Good luck with your Victorian push. Let's hope we get some sense down here from Labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.